All right. We talk about UI quite a bit on this channel, it turns out. And I wanted to explore something new today for the video. So today we are talking about Belly. Belly is a way to write UI for the Bevy game engine, similar to something like Kayak UI or Bevy's own UI implementation. The short pitch for Belly is that we get to define the Bevy UI tree with EML, which is kind of like HTML, and style it with ESS, which is kind of like CSS. And then we have a couple sort of macros like bind and connect and things like that to attach data that changes to those components, we'll call them. Now, the only place you're going to find Belly is in the GitHub repo. It's not on crates.io. It doesn't have a public release yet other than what's sitting in the GitHub repo. Now, this is not uncommon, especially for new libraries, and this is definitively a new library. Which means that if we see any bugs today, we're going to give them a little bit of the benefit of the doubt because I just pulled the code from GitHub and I'm running it, which means that they could have anything on their main branch. And I say that specifically because there is a bug in this color display on the right-hand side. There's a bunch of buttons on the right, there's a bunch of sliders on the left, but every time I move my cursor off of one of these elements, everything resets. So everything works, there's just a slight bug. So we've got these buttons, we can click them, you can see that state hold, you can see it bind to the different squares or the different sliders. And on the left-hand side here, we have what it looks like to write the UI on the right. Of course, as is typical, we get Belly Prelude. I'm actually going to take this opportunity and open it in VS Code so that we get our typical user experience here. Belly has a prelude, much like Bevy has a prelude. And we register the Belly plugin to set up whatever we need Belly to set up. This is a pretty common pattern for Bevy plugins. Then we define the colors for each of these buttons on the right-hand side here as a constant. And all we have in here is this setup function. So this system, the startup system, is just the setup system. There's nothing else. But we can kind of get a feeling for what it looks like to write UI like this. So we need a 2D camera bundle. Pretty typical to need a camera to show UI inside of Bevy. We need to load a style sheet. So we've got colorpicker.ess, which is really interesting. If we go look at colorpicker.ess, it looks a lot like CSS. So I think that if I change the language of this file to CSS, we would get a whole bunch of highlighting and otherwise auto completion and things like that. All of the names seem to be what I would expect from CSS, although I'm not sure that we have access to everything that you would have in a CSS environment. But you can see selectors and classes and tags and things like that. And we'll see slider here as a component name later. So that's what we're doing here. We're loading in that CSS or ESS style sheet. The color box then is this box in the middle. It's the color box that we're filling with color whenever we click on one of these buttons or drag one of these sliders. And we use commands.add to add some of this EML or what looks like HTML to represent our UI. So we've got a body here that encapsulates everything. We've got a span here that encapsulates the sliders on the left. We've got an image which holds the color box in the middle. And then we've got another span here with a for loop for all of the buttons on the right. I'm going to make this a little wider so we can see it. And I think I'm actually going to close down the example for now, since we've already seen it. So EML, it has a couple of things that aren't quite the same as what you would get with HTML, like C controls or on ready. And here in the first span, we see our first macro. So there's the connect macro, there's the to macro, and there's the from macro. And this is how data binding happens inside of Belly. As far as I can tell, you can kind of just bind to entities. I don't know if it's just components and resources, but I know that components and resources do work. For example, here we're working with the background color component that would be inserted into maybe a Bevy style, for example. So we can connect to a component, we can send a value to the component. So for example, here we're sending to the red field, followed by the green, the blue, and the alpha. We can also pull values from resources or components in much the same way anyway. And all of this syntax, I'm not really sure what to call this category of syntax, but it's all kind of like custom syntax, more or less. It's stuff that you're going to have to learn if you want to work with Belly. So we've got these slider components. We've also got this image component, and we see C colon all over the place here. And these are classes. So this is basically class name or class as you would see them in HTML. So the entity that we initialized earlier, color box, is being passed in as the entity of this span here. That's what the curly brace syntax means. So when we did command spawn empty ID, this is now that entity, this span. And we've also got things like for loops. So for color in, and then this value here needs to be an iterator. It's any iterator, anything that you can call into iterator on, I believe. So we use this special for tag, and then we render a button for each of the colors in this colors array. I believe it's an array. Yeah, it's an array. Anytime we press the button, we connect that color box using the background color. And that's basically the TLDR of Belly. It is HTML-like, but not exactly HTML. It is CSS-like, which, as far as I can tell, is actually CSS. Although I'm sure that we don't have access to things like grid, for example. Belly, even though it doesn't have a website, does have a boatload of documentation around how these bindings work, what this syntax is, how the macros work, what the CSS selectors can be, and so on and so forth. So if you're interested in this approach, definitely go check it out, because all of that information and all of the nitty-gritty details that I'm not going to cover are right here in the documentation in the GitHub repo. Now, it does say it has hot reloading, which I'm not sure it does. So let's find out. If I compile this style sheet, let's see. So the background on this slider is supposed to be red, right? Let's make it white, for example. It doesn't look like the CSS is hot reloading. Just make sure that it actually is picking up, and it does pick up if we rebuild. So it says that it does it for the ESS and the EML. So inside of here, we've got button on press color, background color, width. What happens if we change the width here? And if we rerun the application, do we see an actual difference? We do see an actual difference. So it seems that I either don't have the hot reloading set up correctly. I wasn't able to find any configuration to set it up inside of the GitHub repo, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I might have just missed it. So I do think it's an interesting approach. I do actually kind of like CSS. I kind of like having a styling language. If we take a look at sort of the current state of Bevy UI. Now, Bevy UI's strengths are different. Bevy UI's strengths are kind of the fact that all of the node bundles and button bundles and things like that are really well integrated with the ECS system. So for example, this is in some setup function or setup system that I'm running. We do some spawn with this node bundle with some children. We spawn inside of this button bundle, and this happens to be the checkbox. So this checkbox on the left that I'm clicking up and down, but we have to write a second function to handle the checking of the checkbox. So we have to write all of this extra kind of almost boilerplate to hook it up to, in this example, game settings, and then setting the value whenever we click on it. So having something that's a little bit more concise would be really nice. I think that there's a couple competing options right now. There's, of course, Bevy UI, which I think is going to get an overhaul from the Bevy team at some point. There is Kayak UI, which we've covered on the channel already. Now there's Belly, and I'm just happy to see more options. So if you're looking for potentially an option for building Bevy UI, Belly could be it for you. So hope you enjoyed this brief look. I think that we'll probably cover it again when Belly has an actual release to crates.io. And in the meantime, have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you in the video tomorrow.